The first time I saw them, I laughed. I'm not proud of that, but I need to be honest with you because if I'm not honest about what I thought of them in the beginning, then nothing that comes after will mean anything. You won't feel the weight of it. You won't understand why, when it was all over, I sat down on the floor of a shattered command deck and couldn't stop shaking. So yeah, I laughed. We all did. Let me back up. My name is Voss Kerrigan. I was a logistics coordinator for the 7th Interstellar Coalition Fleet, which is a fancy way of saying I moved supply crates, updated manifests, and argued with Draxian cargo officers about weight tolerances for about 16 hours a day. Not glamorous, not dangerous. Just the kind of job that keeps a war running without anyone ever knowing your name. The war, and when I say the war, you already know which one I mean, because there's only ever been one war that mattered in the last 2 centuries. Had been going on for 11 years by the time I got stationed on Outpost Meridian 7. 11 years of the Vekari Dominion pushing outward from their cluster, consuming system after system, converting every resource they found into ships and soldiers, and the particular brand of cold certainty that comes from believing you are the most advanced species in the known galaxy. They weren't wrong about being advanced, that was the problem. The Vekari stood somewhere between 9 and 11 feet tall, depending on which subspecies you were looking at. Their exoskeletal armor plating wasn't manufactured. It grew directly from their bodies, layered and reinforced over decades of life in high-gravity environments. Their sensory apparatus could track a moving target through 3 meters of solid rock. They didn't sleep in any way we understood, and they had been fighting organized wars while humanity was still drawing bison on cave walls. The Coalition had been holding them barely for 11 years, and holding is doing a lot of work in that sentence. More like surviving, more like taking 1 step back for every half step forward and calling that a strategy. So when word came down that a new unit was joining the defense of the Halcyon Corridor, the last navigable stretch of space between the Dominion's advance fleet and the populated systems of the Coalition's core, everyone paid attention. We needed something real, something decisive. Every species in the Coalition had contributed what they had. The Draxians brought their shielding technology. The Selkai brought their psi disruptors. The Vorathi brought their legendary endurance, able to fight in vacuum conditions for up to 6 standard hours. Everyone brought their best. And then humanity sent them. I remember the day the transport docked at Meridian 7. I was on the observation deck running a cargo inventory, cross-referencing fuel cell shipments against projected consumption rates for the next 30-day operational cycle, which is exactly as boring as it sounds. Commander Areth, a Vorathi officer who ran the station's intake operations, was standing at the dock window watching the transport lock into place. Areth had 4 arms, stood about 7 feet tall, and had the general demeanor of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by approximately none of it. She'd been fighting in this war since before I was born. When she spoke, other commanders listened. She watched the human transport dock in silence. Then she said very quietly, "That vessel is small." I looked up from my manifest. She was right. The human transport was noticeably smaller than standard Coalition troop carriers. Not a dramatic difference, but enough that you noticed it parked beside the Draxian cruiser on Dock 4, like someone had brought a utility shuttle to a fleet review. "Maybe it's a scouting unit," I said. "Advance element for a larger force." Areth didn't answer. She was watching the docking tube extend. The first human stepped through 40 seconds later. She was, and I'm going to be precise here, because the precision matters, 5 feet and 6 inches tall. I know this because we ended up serving on the same corridor for 3 months, and I asked her once, and she said 5'6", with the particular flatness of someone who's been asked that question more times than they can count. Her name was Sergeant Mara Delacroix. She was wearing standard-issue Coalition auxiliary uniform, dark gray with the small Earth insignia on her shoulder, a pale blue sphere, stitched carefully into the fabric. She had a pack on her back that looked slightly too big for her frame. She was carrying a rifle that was not the largest weapon I'd ever seen. Behind her came the rest of them. There were 212 human soldiers in total. I counted later, it was in the intake manifest, 212. For context, a standard Draxian combat unit assigned to corridor defense numbered in the thousands. The Vorathi contingent at Meridian 7 alone was over 800 warriors. 212 humans walked off that transport and assembled in the docking bay. They stood in formation, quiet still, and around them, in the corridors and observation areas and through the bay windows, other species watched. I heard a Draxian cargo officer say something to his colleague in their own language. I didn't speak Draxian, but I knew enough to recognize the specific tone, the one that lands somewhere between dismissive and genuinely confused. His colleague made a sound that was the Draxian equivalent of a suppressed laugh. A Selkai technician near the intake console tilted all three of his sensory filaments toward the formation, then tilted them back, which, in Selkai body language, means something like not worth further attention. Even Aruth, who I respected deeply, let out a slow exhale through her breathing slits and said, "Is this all of them?" "Per the manifest," I said. She looked at the manifest, looked back at the humans, said nothing more. I looked back down at my fuel cell calculations, and somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part of me I'm not proud of, I thought, 200 soldiers against the Vekari Dominion. We're finished. The briefing happened 2 days later. By then, the humans had been assigned quarters in Section 9 of the station, the mid-tier residential block, not the premium officers' suites, but not the packed communal racks either. Standard placement for a new auxiliary unit pending assessment. The briefing room at Meridian 7 was built to accommodate multiple species simultaneously, which meant the ceiling was high, the seating was modular, and the air was maintained at a compromised temperature that was slightly too cold for humans and slightly too warm for Vorathi and slightly too humid for Draxians, meaning nobody was entirely comfortable, which Commander Aruth always said was how you knew a truly coalition meeting was happening. The human commanding officer was a man named Colonel Dax Harmon. He was, by every measurable physical standard, unremarkable. Medium height for a human, maybe 5 feet 10. Lean, dark skin with the particular kind of weathered quality that comes from spending too many years in recycled station air and not enough time in sunlight. Gray at his temples. Eyes that had that specific stillness you sometimes see in people who have spent years learning to observe before reacting. He walked into the briefing room like he owned it, which I initially read as arrogance and later understood was something different. Commander Aruth ran the briefing. The situation was what we already knew. The Vekari Dominion's advance fleet, specifically the Crimson Fang Legion, which was the Dominion's most decorated and most feared offensive unit, was pushing through the Halcyon corridor. Intelligence suggested a full assault on the corridor's choke point, a location called the Threnody Gap, within the next 40 to 60 standard days. The Coalition's defensive plan involved layered resistance at 5 key positions along the corridor. Each position would be held by a specific unit, buying time for the others, creating a cascading delay that would, in theory, exhaust the Dominion's offensive momentum before they reached the corridor's end. The human unit was assigned to Position 3. Position 3 was not the front. That honor went to the Draxians, but Position 3 was what strategists called a soft choke point, a location that looked on paper like it could be bypassed, but which actually controlled 3 critical approach vectors. If Position 3 fell, the Dominion could flank Positions 4 and 5 simultaneously, collapsing the entire defensive line in hours. Position 3 was, without anyone saying it directly, load-bearing. When Aruth announced the assignment, I watched the other officers in the room. The Draxian contingent commander, a massive warrior named Gretur, made a sound that might have been a cough but wasn't. The Selkai representative's filaments moved in a pattern I'd learned meant skepticism. A Vorathi lieutenant, sitting 3 seats down from me, leaned very slightly toward his neighbor and said something at a frequency I couldn't hear but whose meaning I could guess from his posture. Colonel Harmon sat through all of it with his hands flat on the briefing table and his eyes on the tactical display. "Position 3, he said when Aruth finished. His voice was level. "We'll take it." Aruth looked at him for a moment. "You understand the strategic significance?" "Yes." "You understand the force projections. The Crimson Fang Legion's assault elements are." "I've read the projections." Another pause. "Colonel, your unit number's 200 and..." 212, he said. "I know how many I have." He said it without heat, without defensiveness, like he was simply confirming a fact. Arith held his gaze for a moment, then moved on. But I saw something cross her face, not reassurance, exactly. Something more complicated, like a question she didn't know how to ask yet. Over the next 3 weeks, while the coalition forces prepared, I found myself watching the humans more than I should have. Partly it was professional. My job involved coordinating supply deliveries to each unit's designated position, which meant I had legitimate reasons to be in Section 9, and around the training areas humans had claimed in the station's lower decks. But if I'm being honest, it was also something else. Something I couldn't quite name. They were strange to watch. Not strange in an unsettling way, strange in the way that, when you've spent years surrounded by species that are larger or more physically formidable or more alien, you start to forget what ordinary looks like. The humans reminded me of ordinary. They trained for 12 hours a day, sometimes longer. Not because anyone required it. Their scheduled training block was 8 hours, same as the other units. But after the scheduled hours ended, small groups of them would keep going, modifying drills, running simulations, breaking down tactics and rebuilding them in different configurations. I saw Sergeant Delacroix once, past midnight station time, alone in a training room running the same movement drill over and over. Breach entry through a confined doorway, clear left, clear right, reset. She must have done it 200 times. Not robotically, each repetition was deliberate, like she was thinking through it, finding tiny fractions of efficiency to shave off. I stopped watching after a while because it felt intrusive, but the image stayed with me. The humans also did something I'd never seen a coalition unit do, which was argue. Not fight, argue. Loud, animated, sometimes heated arguments in their briefing sessions, which their quarters happened to share a thin wall with a station corridor I used regularly. I'd hear voices, raised and tangled together, and sometimes laughter, and sometimes a long silence, and then voices again. Other species found this alarming. The Vorathi lieutenant who lived 2 blocks down from Section 9 came to me once, formally concerned, asking whether the human unit was experiencing internal conflict that might compromise their effectiveness. No, I told him, I think they're just talking. He did not find this explanation reassuring. What I didn't understand then, what I've come to understand since, is that the arguing was the work. That the loud, tangled, sometimes infuriating process of humans disagreeing with each other and talking it through and coming out the other side with something none of them had going in was not a malfunction. It was how they thought. It was the mechanism. Colonel Harmon told me something much later, when the war was different and we had time to actually talk. He said, every one of them is smarter than me about something. My job is to make sure I know what that something is and then get out of their way. But I didn't know that yet. The supply runs to Position 3 started 22 days before the projected assault window. I made the first run personally because the automated routing had flagged a weight discrepancy in the manifest, and I needed to verify it on site. The position was 2 hours out from Meridian 7 by transport shuttle, a region of the corridor marked by dense asteroid debris from a collision event several centuries prior. The debris field created a natural barrier that slowed approach vectors, which was why it was strategically significant. The humans had been there for 4 days when I arrived. I didn't know what I expected. Sandbags maybe, a rough defensive perimeter, the same setup every other unit used. Soldiers on watch, weapons ready, waiting for the clock to run down. What I found was something I had to stop and look at for a long moment before I could fully parse what I was seeing. They had changed the position. The asteroid debris field that surrounded the area, which every other coalition unit would have treated as a navigation hazard to manage around, had been repurposed. Systematically, precisely. Large chunks of rock and metal had been moved and anchored into specific configurations. Not a wall exactly, more like a maze. A series of overlapping barriers and channels that funneled approach vectors into specific corridors. Kill zones. Choke points within the choke point. Small devices had been planted throughout, sensors, I realized after a moment. A detection grid. The kind you'd expect to see in a high-budget fixed installation, not field deployed by 200 soldiers with limited resources. Cabling ran along the underside of anchored debris, insulated and camouflaged. A power system. Not huge, not enough to run heavy weapons, but enough to run something. I found Sergeant Delacroix coordinating a team, near what appeared to be a communications relay mounted in a hollowed-out boulder. "Cargo run from Meridian 7, I said. "I need to verify a weight discrepancy on manifest item 17. She looked at the manifest I handed her, nodded, pointed me toward the secondary storage compartment. Then she went back to what she was doing. I stayed longer than the manifest verification required. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I watched them work. Every human in that position was doing something specific. Nobody was standing around. Nobody was waiting. The colonel was on one side of the field, reviewing something on a portable display with two of his officers. A technical team was running calibration checks on the sensor grid. A four-person squad was rehearsing movement through the debris channels, learning the terrain like it was their own living room. "You moved the asteroids," I said to Delacroix when she passed near me again. "Some of them," she said. "How, you don't have? I thought about the equipment manifest I'd submitted. You don't have the tractor capacity for that." She looked at me with an expression I'd later come to recognize as the human face of "you'd be surprised." "Cable anchors and slow burn. Takes longer but works fine." "That must have taken 4 days," she said. "Yeah." She said it the way you say something obvious, not showing off, just stating a fact. I looked at the repositioned field, the carefully arranged kill zones, the sensor grid threaded through solid rock, and tried to calculate how much coordination, how much physical effort, how much precise planning had gone into this in 4 days with no additional equipment. I couldn't quite get there. "Why?" I asked, which wasn't the most sophisticated question I've ever asked, but was the most honest one. Delacroix was quiet for a second. Then, "Because the position as it was gave us about 40 minutes against a Crimson Fang assault element. This gives us significantly more." "How much more?" She looked at the debris field. Something moved across her face, not confidence exactly, something quieter, something that understood the math and had made peace with it. "Depends on how they come," she said. I filed the weight discrepancy report when I got back to Meridian 7. Then I pulled up every piece of tactical data we had on the Crimson Fang Legion and read it until the station's morning cycle began. The Crimson Fang were not the Vekari Dominion's largest force. They weren't their most technologically advanced. What they were, what they had been for 400 years of recorded Vekari history, was their most adaptive. Other Vekari units followed doctrine. The Crimson Fang wrote doctrine. They evaluated, improvised, overwhelmed. In 11 years of this war, no coalition force had ever successfully repelled a Crimson Fang assault. Not once. Not even close. I sat with that information for a while. Then I thought about a 5'6" sergeant running breach entry drills at midnight, and a debris field that had been rebuilt from scratch in 4 days with cable anchors and slow burn. And I didn't know what to feel. The assault began on day 38. Not day 40, not day 60, day 38. The Crimson Fang's advance came 12 days earlier than projected, which meant half the coalition's defensive preparations were still in progress. Position 1, the Draxians had 70% of their shielding array deployed. Position 2, a Selkai specialist unit was fully operational. Positions 4 and 5 were ready. Position 3, 212 humans, fully ready because they had been ready for 14 days already. I know what happened at Position 3 because of 3 things. The sensor grid data, which was transmitted back to Meridian 7 in real time. The after-action reports, which I read in full multiple times. And because Sergeant Delacroix told me some of it herself later, when she was willing to talk about it. I'll try to piece it together as accurately as I can. The Crimson Fang assault element that hit Position 3 was not their full force. It was a flanking element, standard Crimson Fang doctrine. Send a significant force at each secondary position, while the primary assault element hits the front. Significant in this context meant 400 Vekari warriors, 2 assault carriers, and a mobile siege platform. Roughly 2 Vekari soldiers for every 1 human, plus heavy armor, plus a siege weapon. The assault element's approach was textbook Crimson Fang. Fast, direct, confidence of species that had not been meaningfully resisted in recent memory. They came through the approach corridor at full speed, anticipating that by the time the defenders could respond to their sensor signatures, the vanguard would already be in engagement range. They hit the outer edge of the sensor grid 11 seconds before they expected to reach the defensive position. The grid lit up. 212 humans knew exactly where 400 Vekari warriors were, exactly how fast they were moving, and exactly which debris channels they were about to funnel into. Because the debris field had been rearranged, not as it appeared on any existing map of the corridor. The Crimson Fang's navigational data showed the approach as open, the sensor ghost of an unmodified asteroid field. The reality was a maze with 3 active killing corridors and 17 concealed firing positions. The first Vekari assault wave hit the corridors at full speed. The first thing that happened was that the 2 assault carriers couldn't deploy their troops. The approach channel they'd selected, the one that looked, on sensor sweeps, like the most direct route, was 14% narrower than it appeared, because of a repositioned asteroid cluster that registered as open space at the scanning frequencies the Vekari used. The carriers couldn't get through. They had to brake and reorient. 47 seconds of confusion. 47 seconds during which the Vekari ground troops who had already disembarked were in the kill corridors without carrier support, and the humans were in their concealed positions, and the sensor grid was telling them everything. Sergeant Delacroix told me later, "It wasn't a fight, it was a math problem. We knew where they were, they didn't know where we were. We'd been training in that field for 2 weeks. They'd never seen it." She paused for a second after that and added very quietly, "It was still awful, but it worked." The first wave was repelled in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. The Crimson Fang assault element, 400 warriors who had never been meaningfully resisted, lost their first wave in 8 minutes, with significant casualties, against a force a fraction of their size. The second wave adapted. The Crimson Fang always adapted. They pulled back, reassessed, came back with a different approach vector, trying to find the edges of the detection grid and come around it. They found the edges. The edges were also defended, because the humans had anticipated this. Sergeant Delacroix showed me the planning documents afterward. 17 pages of handwritten notes, actual handwritten, pen and paper, which she said the colonel preferred for tactical planning because it forces you to be concise. Every anticipated Vekari response. Every likely adaptation, every contingency mapped out and countermapped. The plan went 12 levels deep, which is a phrase that sounds abstract until you understand that most military planning, even sophisticated coalition military planning, goes 3 or 4. "How did you know they'd try the eastern vector on the second wave?" I asked. "We didn't know. We had 3 options we thought were likely, and we had responses to all 3 ready." "And if they'd done something you didn't anticipate?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we'd adapt," she said. "That's what we do." The second wave took 31 minutes to repel. The third wave came differently, slower, more careful probe and withdraw pattern, trying to map the sensor grid by walking the edges and measuring response times. Classic Crimson Fang intelligence gathering approach. The humans let them gather intelligence, selectively, deliberately feeding the Vekari sensor probes information that was accurate in its details and deeply misleading in its implications, making certain defensive positions look weaker than they were, making certain corridors look undefended, guiding the picture that the Crimson Fang's intelligence officers were building without those officers realizing the picture was being painted for them. By hour 3, the Crimson Fang assault element had mapped what it believed was the human defensive layout. By hour 3 and 7 minutes, they were advancing on what they believed were 3 unguarded approach vectors. All 3 of those vectors had been unguarded, until 3 minutes before the advance began, when the humans shifted positions behind the cover of a sensor-dampening field they'd never used before that moment. A capability the Vekari's intelligence map did not include because it had been deliberately withheld from every probe and every sensor sweep for 3 hours. I'm going to stop trying to summarize the tactical details because I'm not a military analyst, and I will inevitably reduce something elegant to something clumsy. What I can tell you is this. The engagement lasted 9 hours and 42 minutes. At the end of that time, the Crimson Fang assault element, which had arrived with 400 warriors and 2 carriers and a siege platform, had lost 60% of its ground forces. Both carriers were disabled. The siege platform had been abandoned, and the assault element's commanding officer had transmitted a withdrawal signal. The Crimson Fang had never transmitted a withdrawal signal from a secondary position engagement in 400 years. Position 3 held. I was in the command center at Meridian 7 when the data feeds updated. I was watching the tactical display, watching the engagement metrics, and when the withdrawal signal registered, I thought the display was malfunctioning. I ran a check. It was not malfunctioning. Around me, other coalition officers were watching the same display. Commander Arith was standing perfectly still. She had been perfectly still for about 4 hours, which for a Vorathi is not unusual, but the quality of her stillness had changed somewhere in the last 9 hours. It had started as the stillness of someone watching a situation they expected to resolve quickly and badly. It had become the stillness of someone watching something they couldn't categorize. When the withdrawal signal registered, she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, not the flat command voice, not the clipped tactical voice, something softer and more uncertain. "What are they?" She wasn't asking anyone specific. She was asking the room. Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer that fit. I made the supply run to Position 3 the next day. The humans were still there, still at their stations. The aftermath of a 9-hour engagement was visible in the debris field, new scorch marks on the asteroids, craters where ordnance had hit, the scattered remains of equipment on both sides. The humans were working, clearing, cataloging, repairing, reassessing. Doing after-action review in small groups, clustered around points in the field where specific things had happened, reconstructing the sequence, pulling out what had worked and what hadn't. There were casualties. I knew this from the manifests. 12 humans dead, 31 injured with varying severity. That number had weight. I don't want to pass over it too quickly. 12 people who had gotten on a transport at Meridian 7 3 weeks ago were not coming back. That mattered. And yet, the humans who remained were not moving like a unit that had suffered casualties. They were not subdued or shell-shocked or going through motions. There was something else in how they moved, something I didn't have a word for, not exactly. I found Colonel Harmon standing at the eastern edge of the debris field, looking out into the corridor where the Crimson Fang had withdrawn. "Logistics Coordinator Kerrigan," he said without turning around. "Thanks for making the run." "Sir," I said, "I have the medical supplies priority shipment." "Appreciated." He still didn't turn. "Walk with me for a minute." We walked along the edge of the field in silence for a bit. The light in the corridor was the particular gray-blue of asteroid shadow, light from distant stars filtered through kilometers of debris. "You were watching the data feeds," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." "What did you think?" I considered the honest answer. I gave it. "I thought your position would fall in the first hour." He nodded slowly. "A lot of people did." "I was wrong." "The position held," he said. 12 of mine didn't come home. Those two things are both true at the same time." He paused. "That's always how it is." We walked for another moment. Then he said, "They're going to come back, you know that." "Yes, sir." "Stronger next time, better preparation." "They'll have our playbook from this engagement." "Yes, sir." He was quiet, looking out at the corridor. "So will we," he said. "I want to tell you something about fear. I've thought about this a lot since then, about what it is and isn't. Because the thing I noticed about the humans in that position in the months that followed was not that they were fearless. They weren't. Fear was present in all of them all the time. I could see it in the way they held their bodies before an engagement. In the way some of them went quiet, and some of them went loud, and all of them moved with the particular deliberateness of people who understand that they are in the presence of something that can kill them. The difference, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, was that they didn't let the fear make their decisions. I've served alongside Vorathi warriors who would stand in the face of any physical threat without flinching. I've seen Draxian soldiers absorb punishment that would end any other species and keep fighting. But what the humans had was not the same as that. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was something harder, something that required every single moment a choice. Sergeant Delacroix explained it to me once. We were in the station cafeteria, late, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when most people are asleep. She was drinking something called coffee, a human beverage I'd tried once and found violently unpleasant, but which she seemed to require as a biological necessity. "The Vekari," she said, "they're not scared of us." No, I agreed. That's a problem for them. I looked at her. "Fear is information," she said. "Fear tells you that something is capable of hurting you. If you're not afraid of something, you're not going to prepare for it the way you would if you were. You're going to make assumptions." She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "We've been underestimated our entire history by things bigger than us, stronger than us, older than us, and we've survived every single one of them. So yeah, their contempt is a problem for them." She said it without satisfaction. Without pride, exactly. Just the particular steadiness of someone stating a pattern they've observed over a long time. "Does that make it less frightening?" I asked, knowing that. She thought about it. She gave me a real answer, not a reassuring one. "No," she said, "it makes it meaningful." The Crimson Fang came back 17 days later. Not just a flanking element, the primary assault force. The full weight of the most decorated offensive unit in the Vekari Dominion's history, redirected from the main corridor pushed specifically to eliminate Position 3. Because Position 3, 212 humans holding a debris field that had been rearranged with cable anchors and slow burn, had become, in 17 days, the most strategically significant location in the Halcyon corridor. When the Crimson Fang's primary force came, they came with 1,200 warriors. They came with 4 carriers. They came with a full siege battery and a dedicated intelligence ship whose entire function was to map the human defensive position in real time and relay that map to the assault commanders. They came, in other words, with everything. 212 humans. 1,200 Vekari. And somehow, and I say somehow because even having read every report, every sensor log, every piece of data that came out of those 4 days, there is still a part of me that doesn't fully understand how, somehow, they held. Not cleanly, not without cost. The casualties on the second engagement were worse, significantly worse. By the end of day 1 of the 4-day engagement, the human force had lost 38 people. By the end of day 2, another 22. The position was damaged. Sections of the sensor grid were destroyed. Several of the constructed debris barriers had been breached. And still they held. They held because of things I can partially explain, and things I can't. I can explain the tactical adaptations, the contingency layers, the constant reassessment, the way small teams shifted and covered and improvised as the situation changed. I can explain the sensor grid workarounds they improvised when sections went down, the way they used the Vekari's own destroyed equipment to reinforce breached barriers, the way they used the intelligence ship's own relay signals to feed it false positional data. What I can't fully explain is the hours. The 4th day of the engagement, the humans had been fighting for 72 hours with minimal relief rotations. They were exhausted in a way that, on paper, should have been catastrophic. The Vekari's intelligence assessments certainly thought so. I read their transmitted assessments later, and they consistently projected imminent collapse from hour 60 onward. Collapse did not come. There is a Vorathi concept. I don't know the exact translation. The word sounds like Velkareth, that refers to a state of fighting that goes beyond what the body can sustain, powered by something that isn't physical. Commander Arith used the word once, watching the Position 3 sensor feeds during hour 70 of the engagement. She said it quietly, like she was testing whether the word applied. I think it did. The Crimson Fang withdrew on the morning of the 5th day. Full withdrawal. Not a tactical pullback, not a reorientation. A full withdrawal from the Halcyon Corridor assault operation. Because in 4 days they had failed to eliminate Position 3. They had not flanked 4 and 5. The primary assault on Position 1 was stalled because the Draxians, knowing the flanks were holding, had committed fully to the front engagement rather than holding reserves. The corridor held. The war didn't end there. Wars never end in a single engagement. There was more fighting, more loss, more of the grinding, terrible work of it. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But the Halcyon corridor held. And the moment, the specific moment in the war's long history, when the Crimson Fang Legion transmitted full withdrawal from an operation for the first time in 400 years, that moment came because 212 humans refused to let a debris field fall. I was in the command center when the withdrawal confirmed. This time the room was not quiet. This time, coalition officers from 6 species were watching the same display, and when the withdrawal registered, when it was real, when it was confirmed, the sound that went through that room was something I don't have a word for in any language I speak. Areth stood at the center of it, perfectly still, and on her face was an expression I had never seen her wear before. Not triumph, something older and more complicated than triumph. She turned and looked at me across the room. I don't know why she looked at me specifically. Maybe because I was familiar. Maybe because I was the one who had handed her the intake manifest 3 weeks ago. 212, she said. Yes, I said. She looked back at the display. I need to revise several of my assumptions, she said. I saw Colonel Harmon once more before his unit was redeployed. He was in the docking bay, overseeing the loading of his unit's equipment onto the transport. Moving efficiently, same as always, checking manifests, confirming numbers. The evidence of 4 days of siege warfare was visible on all of them, on their equipment, on their faces, in the way some of them moved. They looked exhausted in a deep cellular way. They also looked like themselves. Colonel, I said. Kerrigan, he shook my hand, a human greeting I'd adapted to over my months at Meridian 7. His grip was solid and brief. Thanks for the supply runs. Where are they sending you? I asked. He gave me a slight smile that said he probably wasn't supposed to tell me and was going to anyway. Wherever the next hard position is, he said. I looked at the humans' loading equipment. At Sergeant Delacroix, directing cargo loading with the same deliberate efficiency she brought to everything. At the soldiers I'd watched argue through tactical problems in Section 9 for weeks. At the unit that had done what 11 years of coalition warfare had been unable to do. They called you a tiny army, I said. He glanced at me. They did. I'm sorry for that. He was quiet for a moment. Don't be, it made some things easier. I understood what he meant, but I still felt the weight of it, the weight of what had been assumed and what had been wrong. Colonel, I said, what do humans have? What is the thing that? I trailed off because I couldn't find the right shape for the question. He thought about it. He took my question seriously, which I appreciated. Nothing special, he said finally. We're not stronger, not tougher, not smarter individually. He paused. We don't know how to stop. We've never been able to afford to. He looked at the transport, at his soldiers. Every generation of us, he said quietly, has had to figure out how to survive something that should have killed us. That's a long time to practice. He clapped me once on the shoulder, noddedly like punctuation, and went back to his manifest. The Halcyon corridor held for 18 more months before the war shifted into its next phase. In those 18 months, the human unit was redeployed 6 times. 6 hard positions. 6 times someone looked at 212 human soldiers and did the math and came up short. 6 times the position held. Not without cost. The casualties grew, names on a list that I kept not officially just for myself because they deserved to have someone track them. The list grew, and the unit kept going. Somewhere in the war's second half, a thing shifted in how the coalition spoke about human soldiers. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It didn't happen in a meeting or a proclamation. It was subtler than that. It was the way a Draxian officer would say when reviewing a defensive assignment, put the humans there. Not dismissively, not as an afterthought, as a decision, a considered one. It was the way the Selkai began requesting human units for joint operations, specifically because of how humans behaved when plans went wrong. The Selkai, who operated best under precise, predictable conditions, had learned that if you put humans in the same operation, the unpredictable things that ruined Selkai precision somehow became manageable, because the humans improvised, because the humans adapted, because when the plan fell apart, the humans looked at each other and started building a new one from whatever was still standing. It was the way Commander Areth, in her final report of the war, which became one of the most studied documents in coalition military history, wrote a single line about human soldiers that I have never forgotten. Do not mistake their size for their measure. The war ended, wars always do. Not cleanly, there is no such thing as a clean ending to 11 years of something like that. But it ended. The Vekari Dominion's advance was contained, and eventually a treaty was negotiated, and eventually both sides began the long, strange work of what comes after. I went home. I think about Position 3 more than I probably should. About a debris field rebuilt with cable anchors and slow burn. About a sergeant running breach entry drills at midnight. About a colonel saying, with complete steadiness, "I know how many I have." About what it means to be underestimated and to understand deeply in your bones that the underestimation is a gift. Here's what I know. The universe is full of things that are larger than us, older than us, more advanced than us, more certain of themselves than we will probably ever be. The galaxy has seen species rise and fall over timescales that make human history look like a single afternoon. And somewhere in all of that, in the long, complicated, often brutal story of humanity, something was forged. Not in a laboratory, not by design. By necessity, by loss, by every generation that had to figure out how to survive something that should have killed them, and did, and passed it on. Call it adaptability, call it stubbornness, call it the specific human talent for looking at a situation that is clearly hopeless and deciding, quietly, to try anyway. The Crimson Fang Legion spent 400 years being the most feared force in the known galaxy. 212 humans made them retreat. Not because they were stronger, not because they had better weapons or more resources or the favor of something cosmic. Because when it was hour 70 and the position was crumbling and the math said collapse was imminent, they looked at each other and they held. That's all. That's everything. I still have Sergeant Delacroix's planning documents. 17 pages, handwritten, pen on actual paper. I've read them many times. The tactical detail is extraordinary, layers of contingency, response matrices, probability assessments that turn out to have been strikingly accurate. But the thing that gets me, every time I read them, isn't the tactics. It's the last line on the last page, written at the bottom in smaller script than the rest, like a note to herself rather than part of the plan. "We've been here before, we know how to do this."